Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Europe Housing Forum and to our session on diverse approaches and common challenges to housing in Western, Southern, and Eastern Europe. We have a range of housing experts from different countries and different fields, from research and policy, and I'm very excited to be moderating this session. My name is Gerald Koessel. I'm from the Austrian Federation of Limited Profit Housing Associations. We are based in Vienna. My background is sociology, and I've previously worked also at the English Federation of Housing Associations. So I'm particularly pleased to lead this discussion about different housing systems across Europe, looking at some of the comparisons and different approaches and challenges. Special thanks also to Habitat for Humanity, who has organized this conference. So our theme is around the diverse approaches and the common challenges. And obviously, one of the most common challenges, I think, and we've seen this just in the previous session, is the topic of affordability. And I think that's also going to be one of the challenges that we're going to discuss in our session. There has been lots of reports recently being published, and we might hear a bit more on that. But basically, the housing affordability question has been acknowledged by a lot of different international organizations, ranging from the OECD, International Monetary Fund, the Joint Research Center from the European Commission. So there's a lot of evidence already out there that we are facing a severe housing challenge, and not only anymore to low-income households, but increasingly also middle-income households who are facing a lot of challenges. And I think the crucial element is also that these challenges are not only any more limited to individual household budgets, but it has become an economic and the social question when it comes to economic stability, social inequalities, and so on. And I think the other main challenge that is really important in this context is the housing quality crisis. We've seen we see a lot of broad variation in terms of housing quality, the quality of thermal insulation, the quality of energy systems, and energy poverty. All questions that I think are really important in terms of the different challenges that we face across Europe. And I think there's also really important to mention that there's definitely not one policy that will solve all the different challenges, but there's very different challenges across Europe. Some regions facing population increases, some regions facing declining populations, and different housing situations. So I think it's going to be really exciting to talk more about that and hear from our speakers. And I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Alice Pittini. She's research director at Housing Europe. Housing Europe is, for those who might not know, is the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing Providers. And it basically is a network for more than 40,000 housing providers across Europe in 25 countries, covering, so these housing providers providing homes to about 25 million people, or 25 million homes, which is more than 10% of the population in Europe. So quite a significant share of the housing stock. And one of the main reports that I just want to highlight also here is a report that is published every 2 years. It's called The State of Housing in Europe, but I'm sure Alice is going to be mentioning that as well. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for this introduction, and good evening, everyone. I will be sharing my screen because I have prepared a small presentation. So, Gerald, can you please confirm whether you're seeing my screen? Yeah?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is this correct? Okay, so thank you very much. I'm also really excited to share the panel with you all this evening, to see some all the colleagues and partners with whom I've worked with in the past. It's really a pleasure to meet you again here this evening. And I think also, having worked in housing from a comparative perspective for over 10 years now, I think I was also really intrigued by the approach for this session, but I'm also very much aware we're trying to compare across this kind of micro region that there's a risk to fall into a trap to generalize too much or to come to some too general conclusions, and I will try to avoid that, although in just 10 minutes it might be a bit of a challenge, but I hope you'll find the presentation interesting. So Gerald has already introduced the network that I work for, Housing Europe. As he was saying, it's a really broader network covering a range of different providers across Europe, and we also have quite a good geographical representation, which means that indeed we are well positioned to talk about the reality faced on the ground by housing providers across the broader European region. Our focus is mainly on European Union countries, but as I mentioned before, the network is also expanding outside European Union through different partnerships and membership, including with Habitat for Humanities and some of the organizations who are here today. So I thought a good starting point to try to compare and try to understand the diversity, but also the common challenges across the three regions mentioned in the title of our session today. So trying to compare Western, Eastern, and Southern Europe in broad terms. It could be interesting to look at current housing policy priorities. So I just did a little exercise for myself based on the OECD Affordable Housing Database latest data release, trying to understand whether there were common trends across and within these regions in terms of housing policies objectives. And what I found as the most probably relevant starting point is that the issue of ensuring access to affordable housing for all is indeed one of the key policy objectives across all countries included in this survey. So as Gerald mentioned at the start of the session, indeed housing affordability has definitely become one of the defining challenges of our times, I would say. Of course, also improving housing conditions for specific housing groups is also a key objective in all countries, but of course when the different target groups or the different groups we focus on vary across the countries and regions. And it's interesting to point out that most countries would point at homeless people and the most vulnerable within the society as one of the specific target groups for housing policies. But there are also other groups that are often mentioned, including, for instance, youth, especially in countries especially in Southern or Eastern Europe, where we see there are really large shares of youth living at home with their parents, and also phenomenon of outward migration of young people linked to employment. Also interesting, the issue of improving housing quality and energy efficiency is a key topic across all regions, but we would see there are huge differences in the starting point and in the current housing quality conditions across these regions. So while in some countries the focus is really on energy efficiency standards and achieving more sustainability, which is also a target that is strongly driven by the European Union policies, of course, in this field. In other areas, especially in Central and Eastern European countries, the focus is really on modernization of the housing stock, and in some cases tackling the current deterioration of housing quality standards. In many of the countries in the region, we see a large part of the stock, especially in big multi-family, multi-apartment building blocks that have serious quality issues at stake. Then, of course, another key issue is that of increasing housing supply, so basically building more overall. And I found quite interesting, this seems to be one of the key objectives, especially in Western European countries. We heard that from Germany, Sweden, UK, the scarcity of building land is a key obstacle in this sense, and also recent trends in the construction sector that poses some serious obstacle. So there are other issues that are more typical of countries that probably will define their housing policies as being in transition, namely some countries in the Central and Eastern European region, but not exclusively. And this is about strengthening institutional capacity and really building a regulatory framework for housing policies, where in some cases these housing policies have been neglected over the past decades. So it's a matter of rebuilding an active state and local government policy in this area. And last but not least, in some cases, we also see a need for increasing housing in a specific tenure. This is again across the board, but I thought it was interesting to mention already that especially in Southern and Eastern Europe, we find a stronger interest in recent years to build or to enhance the rental sector, whether this is private rental sector and also social rental housing. So I think this gives quite an interesting picture to start with, but as I said, so the one common issue seems to be the common objective of having more affordable housing for a wider share of the population. And in this respect, I think it's also useful to reflect not only on housing affordability in terms of the outcomes for households. I think Jozsef will tell us more about that in his presentation, but here I wanted to try to understand what we talk about when we talk about affordable housing, which is often a term that is used to refer to a number of different housing policies. So in this sense, the so-called affordable housing continuum that was produced by the EU Urban Agenda Housing Partnership, it's quite useful to try to categorize this concept as, let's say, a category of housing that includes social housing, but also other types of affordable rental housing and even affordable home ownership. We have to keep in mind, indeed, these are all instruments of housing policies that are present to different extents across Europe. But also important is to keep in mind the diversity, not only in housing policy tools, but also in the existing structure of the housing markets that we're talking about. And especially, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the diverse tenure structure that we find across Europe. So one common element is that in general terms, owner-occupied housing is the predominant tenure across Europe, but this, of course, varies to very different extents across the region, with the exception of Germany and Switzerland, where you have basically as many tenants as owner-occupiers, or even a little bit more. Other than that, most countries in Europe have a larger owner-occupied stock. But we go from countries like Romania or even Hungary and many countries in the Central and Eastern Europe region, but also countries that are, let's say, facing the Mediterranean, like Spain or Italy, Portugal, Greece, where the owner occupation is prevalent to the point that other tenures and especially social housing are really minimal, I would say. So looking more in particular at the social housing stock, because this is probably the main focus of the activities of our members within Housing Europe. If we look at the size of the social rental sector in European countries as a percentage of the total housing stock, here again we find huge diversity. The Netherlands being the country with the proportionally largest social housing stock, with almost 30% of the total housing stock in the country. But then there are also countries like Austria, Denmark, public housing in Sweden, UK and France, where the sector is quite large, with between 15 and 20%. But the rest of the countries, even within the European Union, have a much smaller share of social rental housing. And here again, we can talk about regions in the sense that in many Mediterranean or southern countries, the share of social rental housing is quite small, having these countries chosen home ownership policies as the favorite policy tradition in this area. And the same goes for most Central and Eastern European countries, although there the situation today is mainly to be attributed to the results of the large-scale privatization process that took place over the past 3 decades by now. But again, this is a very general picture, and I'm very much aware, and we will probably hear more about that later on, that even within these regions, there are huge differences across countries, and even within countries, if we look at the local level and the policies implemented by the different cities. So once again, this is more to give a general picture. Talking about social housing and social rental housing, it's also important to keep in mind that, of course, there's no single or official definition that is applied across Europe. Actually, we find a wealth of different traditions and different definitions, sometimes even within countries, and the term social housing is often used as a shortcut to refer to different types of programs and schemes that have been implemented over time. But they all have in common basically the idea that social housing is more affordable than housing offered on the market. It is allocated according to certain rules that mean it gives an opportunity to find decent homes also for those that are not able to secure it on the market. And of course, it's financed to some extent, at least to some extent, by some kind of public intervention. But here again, we find maybe a common challenge, that is the decreasing public funding and public support for the sector over the past decades. And indeed, I wanted to show you, based on available data on government spending in housing, we can clearly see that over the past 2 decades, actually, basically public investment that goes into supporting housing development and social housing development has fallen significantly. But at the same time, and in a way to compensate maybe for the lack of affordable housing available, spending on housing benefits directly to the households to help them pay the rent, to help them paying for the housing costs, has kept at a significant level and even increased in many countries. So keeping this in mind and considering the fact that I think in a way, as it happened after the global financial crisis in 2008, housing was very much high again on the political agenda. But I think after the COVID crisis, even much more so, because what the pandemic, maybe one of the good aspects of the pandemic, if we can say so, was to bring really to the spotlight the fact that inequalities in access to housing and in housing conditions are no longer acceptable, as they have too huge an impact on the well-being and the possibilities of people, of households across Europe. So considering this new or renewed political attention for housing. And considering the fact that we don't yet see a sustained trend towards more long-term policies and more long-term investment in the affordable and social housing sector, we had this idea of entering a cooperation with UN Habitat and UNECE. And we worked together in the framework of the Housing 2030 initiative, which is a very interesting policy initiative that has just produced results available in the form of a report and a website of which I included the references here. And the idea with this really ambitious 2 years project was to create an adaptable toolkit presenting policy solutions that have worked in a given context. So this should not be understood as a one-size blueprint, as we are very much aware that the diversity of housing policies and housing conditions necessarily call for adapted solutions at the local level, but it's a way to basically inspire policymakers by looking at a range of solutions that have worked across the European region and beyond. So with this, I think I have probably exhausted my 10 minutes, so I will leave you here for the time being, but I remain available for questions and for the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I think it was really setting the scene very nicely for our discussion, going into some of the aspects around affordability, the institutional setting of different countries, the actors that are involved, and I think most importantly in the last decade, also the impact of the global financial crisis and more recently of COVID-19 and how this has really brought to the fore the housing crisis. I will hand over to our next speaker now, and we will have a bigger roundtable discussion at the end of for all the speakers. Our next speaker is Grzegorz Gajda. He's a senior urban specialist at the European Investment Bank, where he's responsible for appraisals of urban investment projects which are proposed for the financing. Grzegorz has previously worked at other European and international organizations, such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. He's specialized in housing finance, including the financing of energy efficiency projects. So I think he's going to bring another really interesting perspective on this topic. So over to you, Grzegorz.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd be very happy to contribute to this discussion. And it's great that Alicia has really set a very good scene, which will help me to include those topics in my little contribution to our discussion tonight. So I will try to tackle two topics. One would be to maybe give a little bit more granular presentation of the social and affordable housing as sub-component of entire housing market in Poland, which is the country I'm coming from. But then I would like to share with you a few thoughts from the financing institution of the European Investment Bank. What are the challenges and what are the commonalities in different housing approaches among various clients that we work with in the housing sector? So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the situation in Poland, we have to say that it's a country that followed this trend of massive privatization of previously government-owned housing, and this decision has shaped the market as we can see today. So in Poland, we have about 14.5 million housing units, of which only 800,000, more or less, are within the affordable housing category, the one from the housing spectrum that was included in Alicia's presentation. 800,000 of 14.5 million is about 5.5%. And although the government has been spending significant amounts of money through various programs, those that are also supported by the EIB, the stock of that housing has decreased from 1.2 million to this 800,000 today, mainly due to elimination from the housing stock of buildings whose technical state was bad, inadequate for the people to live. So despite all the spending, it was not really possible to increase the stock of the housing. So the 14.5 million of housing units that we have today has been a success of private sector mainly. Poland as a country has always been a country with quantitative deficit of housing. That is the reality that the nation has been living with for over 100 of years. Lack of housing was always an issue, but since 10 years, we no longer have the quantitative deficit. Of course, we have a qualitative deficit of housing, and very often the housing which is available is located not where the people would like to live. So we have very big number of depopulating cities, which is a result of changes in the industrialization. The main agglomerations where business is developing well still show very significant housing deficit. And also Eurostat statistics are showing very strong affordability issues in those agglomerations, especially in the private rental market. And this is where the government policies are insufficient and the government spending is inadequate to alleviate that situation. Although we see quite a big increase over the last 10 years in those spendings, it is still not sufficient. We need a change that would be a game change. We need to have changes by at least 10 times the spending have to increase in order to really have a visible change in terms of housing affordability. The affordable housing spectrum in Poland is divided in three main categories defined by the income. This is an interesting policy decision because it also defines the rent level. So the rent level and the housing category depends on the income, which leads to certain level of ghettoization. So people from different income category typically would live in separate buildings rather than together. Rent setting is based on housing costs. So it's not means tested, is linked to the quality of the property, to its location. And there is a very strong regional defining mechanisms for rent and for rental eligibility, actually. So larger cities and agglomerations have much higher rates than rural areas or regions that are not so economically developed. So that is the Polish situation. It's very similar to the countries of other Central and Eastern European countries. And from the point of view of the EIB, this is what we really see. We see very big division between Western European countries, strength of their housing institutions, which lead to very big amounts of borrowings that we offer to those institutions, which then convert into really big investment in housing projects in Western Europe. Whereas from the countries of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe, we actually have very little demand for our financing in housing. Although we try to work with those countries and with the cities and other entities there, it's difficult to see demand picking up. There has to be some mental change in policies that would result in unblocking investment potential in this sector, because the needs are clearly there. We can see that, and certain mindset change is required. I have to say that the focus on housing ownership seems to be very prevalent in decision makers in countries of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe. Despite all the work done by European institutions, NGOs, and researchers who underline the need to balance the offer of housing between the private and public rental, very often still the policies favor private housing ownership, which then, as we can see from statistics, is actually resulting in affordability constraints, especially for younger people and especially in rapidly developing agglomerations. So just to sum up, here at the EIB, we welcome and we would like to support activities that would lead towards rebalancing that situation and bringing more investments in the housing, in the affordable housing specifically, in those regions of Europe which currently are lagging behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregor. I think that that really brought together now the sort of national perspective and also perspective from the European Investment Bank and the perspective of housing finance, which maybe we have a bit more time to discuss in the roundtable discussion, because I think it is one of the main questions that we need to answer. But before doing that, I'm going to hand over to our third speaker, Jozsef Hegedus. Jozsef Hegedus is a managing director at the Metropolitan Research Institute in Hungary, a think tank working on urban and housing policy. He has worked as a researcher and consultant on housing and urban policy in various national and international bodies. And he's also a lecturer at the University of Budapest and has taught courses at the Central European University and the Budapest University of Technology. His recent research has focused on the analysis of changes in housing regimes in Eastern Europe and in particular in Hungary. So I look forward to hearing some more about more general questions on affordability and also on Hungary, if you are planning to say anything on that. So over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It was to extend. And thank you very much for Alice and Grzegorz for the presentation, because it very much helped me to focusing on some issues which I think is very relevant in these days. Of course, the starting point and or the title of my contribution would be the regional varieties of affordability. So the affordability is not the same in different parts of the Europe. And I think that the most important factor influencing the affordability is the housing, is the economic structure, economic development, the growth model of the different parts of the Europe, and the welfare system, that how the welfare system intervene in the social inequalities. Even the very simple classification we already, with our colleagues, have done in the last years, just to compare the countries, 3 types of the countries, the Western and Northern Europe, South Europe, and the new member states. And you can see a very important differences that was already mentioned by both Alice and Grzegorz. The simplest thing is that if I'm focusing on new member states, they have much lower GDP, and they have a very different economic growth model, which one element of the informal economy, even in these days, are much higher than any other part of the Europe. The demographic situation is very different. There is no demographic pressure the same as in the Western Europe and in South Europe as well. And the third element, which already were mentioned, that the condition of the housing is very, 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 very different. If you just compare the average size of the apartments and the houses, it's 30% less than in Europe. We have only 2 or 3% of social housing, like in Western Europe, we have 12-13% average, and the housing finance system is much less developed. If you compare the outstanding mortgage to the GDP ratio, you see that in the new member state it's 18%, like in all Europe it's 50%. So I think even this very simple comparison say something very different picture of the affordability problem. But I think the key question is of the affordability problem, the inequality. And this is what we sometimes forget about talking. And this is why how the social structure has been changed in the last years. It has a lot to do with the today situation, because not just the poor people, but the low middle class people are in situation that they have very, very difficult situation to afford a proper housing. So in my contribution, I would like to draw on a recent research. In age 2020, we are working with colleagues, Uplift, which compare different urban regions, and I would like to introduce a kind of typology which say that there are urban regions which are increasing and growing, and there are urban regions that are shrinking or very stagnating. It's a very different situation, I think. In the growing regions, there is a demographic pressure. There are a huge shortage. It was already Richard mentioned that behind it is the land scarcity and sometimes the building regulations. But there is the house price and rent increase much faster than the average income, and it's force the financialization element is very important, and unfortunately, because housing is a kind of target for speculative investment and investment for even the upper middle class as a safeguard against the pensions, it's contributing to the problem. On the other side, there is shrinking areas where the nature of the problem is more in the quality and the quality of the housing. And and because of the shrinking area, the mortgage market is much more severe. So there are much higher mortgage costs, and it's causing a different kind of the problem. But there is a trend that this discrepancy is increasing. But in other side, in Europe, we have to think about Europe has a very special social model where the welfare institutions and measures are very, 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 very important. And here again, in our typology, we can differentiate between the systems where have a very important redistribution element in the welfare system, and there are countries and cities where this redistribution element is not important. There is a huge literature on it, but I think the simple way is that there are a lot of countries, and especially the new member state, the welfare system is not developed. It's developed in the terms of the measures, I mean the type of the measures, but it is not developed as an efficient intervention in the social inequality. So if you see this typology, that growing and shrinking area and solid and very stable welfare system and not welfare, you can see a very interesting differentiation of the countries. If you see the welfare element, it's very important that the welfare element is not just housing, it's not just lack of the social housing, if you are talking about the new member state, but it's the lack of the income redistribution, lack of the stability, lack of the safety, safety net. And I just to see in our case we have Amsterdam, which is the one type which has a good welfare system and a growing rate, and Bratislava was the other one which has a very few very weak welfare system. Is a growing city, and there are in Hungary the page and what is the similar situation in Lodz, for example, in Poland, which is a shrinking city. And in the western part of the Germany, the Chemnitz is a good example of the shrinking, but a very strong welfare system. And if you see the housing policy in this case, they are very different, both in Bratislava and Lodz or Pécs in Hungary, the southern parts of the Hungary. There is 3% in the city, 3% of the stock is socially. So I think that this is this kind of the type of give a more diverse picture of the nature of the affordability problem. And just to go to the Hungarian case, and just to give an example, one of the real problem of the last 30 years that we in Hungary we had a huge investment in housing, but most of this investment disappeared in the system. So this is the key element which were missing, and this is the problem of the housing policy instruments and institutions, that we are putting a lot of money, it is not targeting properly, and there is no any condition that the people who got the subsidy, they cannot capitalize the subsidy individually, and there is not a long-term solution for housing. And the last point what I want to make is that because of this inequality situation, the intergenerational transfer became the key element of the housing affordability. So it's really a responsibility of the researchers and the politicians for the long-term programs, that if for the EU resources, if hopefully come for this region, it should be designed in a way that the money and the asset should remain in the sectors and should serve affordability for a longer term. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jozsef. I think that's a really important additional element now in when you talked about the sort of growing inequalities in relation to housing, because I think that this is one of the key challenges, and also the different sort of broader policy components that we need to consider in terms of the welfare systems, but also the demographic situation. So yeah, it is a big challenge, but I think before going to the general discussion, I'm going to hand over to our last speaker, Rachael Marie Scicluna. She's an urban anthropologist and a housing policy consultant within the Ministry of Social Accommodation in Malta. And she's also a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of the Built Environment at the University of Malta. And she has a lot of research experience on the interrelationship between the home, infrastructure, and urban policy. And so I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and it's a great pleasure to be here this evening with you all. It's actually an honor to have this unique opportunity to discuss challenges that are related to a housing sector, which is, in my opinion, continuously shifting and changing, which, as you know, we've heard from the previous speakers as well, it's quite of a unique industry. And in my opinion, it's unique and it's different to other industries because it capitalizes on a fundamental human right, which is basically our home, whilst at the same time, it treats it as both a capital and a commodity. But what is great today is, this evening, is that we're going to be exchanging practices and hearing from different parts of Europe, where the aim is to find solutions and also a way forward, which to me is quite hopeful. In my capacity as an urban anthropologist, what I like to do, and this is what I will be doing as well through my little presentation, is to combine lived experiences. So the everyday, and I will give a context which is very much related to south of Europe, which is Malta, and I will be using Malta as a case study, but I will actually use a little bit of a lens. So I will hone into the cultural aspects of the lived experiences of how it is to live in housing over here. So what I will do is I will try and find meaning, answers and solutions by combining culture to housing and also good governance and to some extent infrastructure. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. So, but before I think one of the challenges that we are facing is urban and housing precarity and a lack of a housing system. And I will start with a little story, which is about a fictional character based on research material. So it's based on facts that I collected over the years, both in research that I conducted in Malta, but also in the UK. So let me tell you this little story. So let's imagine for just a moment how your life would be if you live in a poorly regulated housing system. Imagine if your housing situation depended on a month-by-month rental agreement and that you could be evicted any time without any good reason. Imagine if your financial income was on a week-by-week basis and that you keep missing paying rent or a loan mortgage. Such financial precarity may well leave you with no choice but to borrow money illegally. Besides your precarious financial situation, imagine if your house was of low quality standard, poorly insulated or with inadequate street connectivity to generic amenities and main transport routes. Imagine you had no one to care for your disabled child or sickly father while you went to work. Imagine how your daily state of mental health would be if you found yourself in a similar situation. So this little imaginary portrait is indeed a fictional character. It's a composite character that I built over the years from the multiple stories that were collected. But I do think that here we have a character which is relatable to most European urban zones and cities. And I think this here, what we are witnessing in Europe in general is that we have very specific or irregular migratory patterns where we're seeing people shifting from rural to urban zones, from conflict areas to developed countries, and it's also related to economy. On one hand, for example, in Malta, our sense of housing precarity is related to rapid economic growth, whilst in other countries, perhaps like Italy or Greece, we're seeing housing and urban precarity, which is very much related to a financial crisis. However, such a scenario, in my opinion, needs good governance, but this is not always easy to achieve. And towards the end of this presentation, I will be offering some solutions. Let's start with the challenges. Inbuilt in this storyline is actually a common obstacle, which is the lack of a compassionate, and I stress this term, a compassionate housing system. But it's also about the way we perceive our homes, as homes being static, unchanging, and safe spaces. From this scenario that I presented, we can see that actually our homes can be spaces of discrimination, violence, or abuse. Instead, we need to be thinking of homes as a process. But what is, I think, another driver which is leading to the sense of housing precarity is the housing industry itself. So the housing industry sometimes, or more often than not, treats our homes as capital, and can itself be the driver of certain inequalities and injustices, especially those which are related to class. We've heard earlier that even the financially stretched middle class is now actually seeking for affordable or social accommodation. We have issues which are related to gender, ethnicity, aging, disability, race. The list is never ending. So what we're dealing with here is a living paradox, where on one hand we're dealing with a space which we call home, and it is our that we consider as a safe space, whilst on the other hand we have an economy or a percentage of the GDP which is dependable on the housing and construction industry. So now let's go back to Malta for a short while, and I'd like to unpack this scenario. So in Malta, we are at the stage where we're building a housing system, but why did we have a lack of it? Why did we not have a housing system until now? Because we're still building it. I think the idea behind it, the reason behind it is that, you know, we had, superficially we can say that we had no unified or systemic housing policy. But I believe that this is a very superficial observation, and I think it deserves a broader cultural analysis of the local situation. So, who are we on this little, island, and this island is archipelago? So Malta is a kinship-based society. It is very much based on family networks. So a lot of informal care, especially in later life, is still provided by female family relatives. And this relates, for example, to gender. This specific fact was in fact reinforced by the latest report in the Gender Equality Index, which was published only a couple of weeks ago, where it stated that most care is still being done by daughters and family and female relatives. And now this suggests perhaps why we did not have a housing system before, because the family is what is serving society, or it's the family that is offering care instead of the state, despite the fact that we do have a welfare state. And this also may be the reason why we lack alternative accommodation, such as affordable housing, housing cooperatives, community-led housing, and sheltered accommodation for older people. In fact, as we've seen in the very first presentation, in that really nice graph, Malta is in fact a nation of homeowners. Another significant reason to why we lack a housing system is the recent change in family legislation, which is also attributed to new realities, which are brought about by an economic boom, by different migratory patterns, demographic changes as well. And this is, as you can see from this timeline here, that such changes in legislation do bring about different pressures on the local housing market. And as you can see from this timeline here, the household was actually at the core of such shifts, ending with the Private Residential Leases Act, which was it became an act actually in 2020, and in fact it was a reaction to an unregulated private rented sector, which was brought about by an economic boom that dates back to around 2013. And through this timeline, what we can observe is how Malta, like other post-industrial countries, is experiencing a reconfiguration of the family and the domestic setting. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we have, for example, an increasing low fertility. In fact, Malta ranks quite low with a fertility rate of 1.2, whilst we have an increasing life expectancy rate, which is, of course, like most European member states, including the world globally, we have an aging population. So what does this mean? It means that our contemporary homes cannot be understood through the dominant narrative or rhetoric of the 20th century of the traditional or the heteronormative family. Instead, what we really need to understand is that the new form, the new family configuration comprises of female-led single households, intergenerational households, shared professional households, solo living. There's also a rise of people wanting to, be single and live solo by choice, which is an interesting trend. Living apart and blended families, and of course the LGBTIQ families as well. In fact, in latest research from the Housing Authority, we saw that 75% of those applying for social accommodation are in fact single mothers with children. So with this social and legislative context in mind, it starts, and I hope, to become clear that there is an ill fit between the needs of the 21st century domestic setting and policy making, which enhances, in my opinion, housing precarity. Right, so therefore, housing precarity, in my opinion, can be summarized through three primary issues. One is related to current misconceptions of how we conceptualize our homes and modern families, including, because we did not touch upon homelessness at all over here, how homelessness, there is a shift, there's the changing face of the homeless person, including the homeless family. In Malta, we're also seeing homeless people who have a disability, including older people. The fact that we see home as static, right? And this leads to a discordance between contemporary domestic realities and policy making. So the above, these observations lead me to make a call, and I would really like to stress on this, to make a call to all policymakers that we need to treat the changing household as a serious unit of analysis for policymaking. And in fact, what I'm suggesting here is that we need to see our homes as a melting pot. And they can be, one of the greatest powers of integration. And they can be also a symbol of diverse communities where we can talk about conviviality. In fact, the home can be seen as part of a complex web of relations of wider society and culture. So it can be an enabler of social cohesion. So what is the way forward? Because we do need some good news as well. From this discussion, I hope it becomes clear that there is a need for a compassionate governance that creates opportunities for all to access housing. Also, as we saw from the little story that I narrated, a housing system that is poorly regulated can be detrimental to society, its economy, health, including urban planning. So I would like to propose four guiding principles on which a good housing system could be based. And these are in line with the Housing 2030 initiative as well, that first of all, we need to think of a home and not a house when we are designing our policies. And once we take that mental shift or that paradigm shift, we will be able to think of our homes as generators of human flourishing, as connectors to a network of open and green spaces, that they could also be the foundation of political and economic resilience, and in fact that we have a right to housing. So in short, a good housing system, and I think we've been discussing this to some extent, requires also proactive leadership and commitment based on participatory governance, or what I'm referring to as compassionate governance. It should also be about homemaking and community engagement, in addition to regulation, inclusive design, financial security, identity, and belonging. So what we can do is to imagine housing policy as being the skeleton of a housing system, whilst our homes can be thought of as the building blocks of a healthy nation and as enablers of social cohesion and integration. In short, and I will conclude with this little quote, is that without a functioning housing system based on a justly governed system which sees a direct relationship between everyday lives of people, because after all, policy does have a direct impact on our lives. Housing policy, financial prosperity, inclusive infrastructure, and good health, our society cannot truly flourish. And I shall conclude here.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think that was really inspiring and really important concepts also that you brought up here, like the concept of housing precarity, the compassionate governance. I think generally the topic of governance, I think is really crucial. And also the sociological or anthropological sort of dimension that you brought into the discussion, I think is really important. So we have about half an hour left, if I'm right. I would like to use this time to pose at the beginning a few questions, individual questions addressed to you, and then I've seen already some people have posted questions, so people should also feel free to post some more questions in there, so we'll open up the discussion later on. But before that, we've heard a lot about many different aspects, and I'd like to start maybe with Alice, coming basically from a sort of EU level perspective. Can you say something about maybe what you think in terms of governance, what you think what should be done at the EU level, and maybe what would be better to set at the regional level or national level in terms of creating good, affordable housing?
Thank you, Gerald, for this question. It's indeed a tricky one. It would deserve an entire session just for this, but I think so. There are different elements at play. I think the European Union can be, let's say, a driving and inspiring force when it comes to housing. We see that with the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights, the right to housing in its different elements, let's say, is really become, it's more seen as an integral part of the construction of social Europe. So this is really something very encouraging. There are a number of interesting initiatives over recent years that had a really useful approach. For instance, if I think again of the EU Urban Agenda Housing Partnership, it really had the value of bringing together for the first time different stakeholders in a sort of multi-level governance structure, going from cities to government representative stakeholders, the financing institutions. And the dialogue generated there and the proposals put forward in the action plan were really important and really good. And of course, there's also a very strong aspect linked to the current policies like the EU Green Deal, the renovation wave. So all the efforts that the European Union is putting in trying to turn housing in really an engine for a more sustainable economy and a key part of the fight to tackle climate change. So I think from all these respects, the European Union can offer a really useful framework, without forgetting, of course, also another key element, which is the importance of EU funding and financing opportunities that Grzegorz mentioned before and that were touched upon in other sessions during this forum. So all of these can contribute to creating an enabling environment. There are also other aspects of regulations that are, let's say, in a way limiting the scope of policymakers to define their housing programs and the state aid to the sector at the local level. So this is another issue, but I would say more in general, it's also important to keep in mind that because of all this diversity and the differences embedded in the different housing systems, housing is one of the areas where the principle of subsidiarities, meaning that the final responsibility for housing policies lies at the level of the member states, is something really that we cannot oversee, basically. So I would say these are my main points, but I also wanted to add that something which is really off the top of my head, and I think it was triggered by some of the comments I heard from the other speakers today, and I'm thinking in particular of Jozsef talking about the multi-generational transmission of inequalities through housing. So next year will be the European Year of Youth. And I think this is really one of the key areas where the governments, the member states and Europe are not yet doing enough, I would say, to guarantee better access to housing for young people and for the future generation. So I think this could really become a key topic in the future and given current trends.
Thanks a lot. I think that's really interesting. And I think it's also a good idea to, if you have any comments on other speakers, I think, yeah, just feel free to add to the discussion here. But maybe my next question to Grzegorz, if you could say something. I mean, I was quite astonished by how you described that there's a big division within Europe in terms of EIB funding. And I don't know if it is possible, but do you think you could describe maybe what it needs in terms of the institutional settings, maybe also in these countries, or which other factors would be important so that we can overcome those divisions in terms of EIB funding?
Yes, I think that one interesting thing would require a little bit of a mental shift, is to start thinking about social and affordable housing not as a charity or a humanitarian activity, which is provided by the government to ensure that people can actually have a roof over their head, but to look at the sector as an important economic sector, as an important element of economy, of competitiveness of different cities. I'd like to link it very much with what Alicia said about the youth. When I'm thinking about my own children, given the system that housing is today, my own children will be living in an apartment, typically privately rented. They will be paying probably all of their income to pay rent to somebody from my generation. This intergenerational transfer, which is happening today, is something that hasn't really happened in the past. And I guess we should really feel more responsible towards the youth. So based on this, I believe that governments should think about this sector as a way to offer young people not just housing in the situation that they otherwise would find themselves on the street, but as a housing that enables their mobility, that would contribute to the ability to start families. And if this mental change can happen in the minds of local and central government politicians, this could actually lead to the change that we would like to see. So I think that this is really how we should be talking about housing, and hope that we can get this narrative to the mainstream of housing-related discussions in the countries of European East and South. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that contribution. I think that touches really an important point that I also observe, like personally, in terms of attitudes towards affordable and social housing, because you often end up people seeing it either as a sort of social service that is entirely funded by the state, or they see the private sector doing the jobs. I think bringing in also the perspective of different actors, I think might be another interesting element. But before we go into the more general discussion, I'd like to ask Jozsef about, in your discussion, I found it really interesting, the sort of intergenerational dimension, and we've just also heard more about that from Grzegorz. So what do you think would be maybe effective ways in terms of preventing those rising inequalities across generations or within generations in terms of housing policies? What sort of housing policies do you think would be most effective to tackle some of these inequality challenges?
Thank you very much. I really join into the Grzegorz comment that I think it's very important that this affordable housing should be economically sustainable sector. So it is. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need a subsidy. but it's with a subsidy. If there is a subsidy element which make cheaper for or more make affordable for housing for the young generation, should be remain in the sector. This is what we haven't learned in the last 30 years. We put really 1.5% of the GDP per year in the sector, and the money was leakage to the entrepreneurs, to the banks, and very few remained for the private families. And even if it remained, it wasn't there for the next generation housing situation. So we have to change the, if probably mean the same thing is the mentality that yes, we need an affordable housing sector which keep or which have a subsidy element, but the people and the families are paying proportionally to their income the cost of the housing, which make sustainable for the long term. So this is what we are working in Hungary. Even the Budapest has a new housing policy, which has two elements. One is the social rental agency model, which is not just the model when you, from the private sector you rent apartments and allocate for the needy people, but even integrating the municipality-owned stock in the system and open up of the targeting group from the very, very poor to the low middle class, who are very difficult situation as well, teachers, nurseries, even policemen. So they are paid in a very limited way for financing a market rent. And the real problem is that if you have a very uncertain middle class or precarious in the society, and have a very unstable housing system, it could be, as a combination, could be very, very, very bad. And in the and if we are not doing right now, even with step by step some new measures, this problem will be very, very difficult in later.
Thank you very much for that response. My next question to Rachael, because you described a lot about the sort of sociological elements about housing precarity. I'd be interested to get to know a little bit more about the sort of specific context in Malta, and in terms of the current sort of plans within the ministry to put forward or specific sort of policies to address some of the challenges that you've mentioned. You could expand on some of that.
Sure, I think the situation in Malta is very much similar, to all these, to all other post-industrial, European member states, where we have, changing demography, where even, young families, as we've heard, we have a new middle class, which is expanding as time goes by, which is the financially stretched middle class, which comprises of, professionals. As we've heard as teachers or people who are professional and very well educated. So all of a sudden you have people that are seeking or are unable to enter a loan mortgage to purchase their own homes, even with two incomes. So what we're seeing is that we're having young families opting not to have children. So we're seeing a shrinking of the family, the size of the family as well, as is happening elsewhere. But in Malta, it's quite rapid. It's happening quite rapid. On the other hand, what we're trying to do is, for example, with an economic boom, which happened around 2013, 2014, we had a very regular housing market, which was quite new. It was a niche market. Because prior to 2013, the private rented sector was very much associated with the poor and was very much stigmatized. But all of a sudden we had migration patterns which brought in, quite wealthy Europeans also irregular migration from third country nationals, and also south of Europe and north of Africa as well. So we had this kind of shift, demographic shift happening, where we had internal migration, people moving from south to north, to other islands, whilst at the same time other people which were wealthier were able to purchase housing. So what we did was sought to regulate the private rental sector through the Private Residential Leases Act. And what we saw there is that we asked for people to start registering contracts, because before it was, basically we had nothing. It was a very informal market. At this point, we have about 40,000 registrations. So we're able to count how many, private rents we have, and in that way, the market will stop, being based on speculation. And I think this is what we were trying to do, is to have a better picture of who's living in social housing, the private rented sector, and in private home ownership. At the same time, we're offering different housing pathways. For example, we're building new affordable housing. We have transitional housing as well, like specialized housing, where people who are unable to, or for one reason or another, fall off the housing ladder, they're able to enter into specialized housing, and they're followed by with a care plan. So we have different pathways in order to try, and eventually, very soon, we'll be launching a housing system, which will be worked with other ministries as well.
All right. Thank you very much for that. That's really interesting. I'd like to open the discussion now to some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. There was someone, Alejandro Yaramilo, asking about the role of the private sector playing in the social housing sector. Anyone would like to respond to that, maybe? Yeah, go ahead, Gregor.
Yes, I actually had a very similar question in another conference a couple of days ago. And basically what I would like to repeat here is that I don't really see feasible that suddenly private sector would start offering housing at a lower price that they can actually get at the market. And to be honest, I don't really think to expect something like that from private sector makes sense. I think that we do expect private entrepreneurs to try to maximize their profits. That's how they strive for innovation, and that's how they strive for efficiency. I believe that it is really a role for public sector to ensure housing affordability through regulation of the market and delivery of the supply that the private sector cannot deliver. So supply in the low income and lower medium income categories. So I don't really see much role of private sector here, to be honest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Jozsef, you also wanted to add something?
A very simple thing. I think that there is one possibility, that in the new member states, the private rental sector is very unregulated. It means that there is a lot of risk on both sides, on the tenants and the landlord side as well. I see some kind of possibility there if the state and the local government regulate and take over the risk element. The rent could go down by 10, 15, 20%, and even supplemented minor subsidy, a 10% subsidy, it could develop, include the private sector in the whole system, without this incentivizing them for coming out from the sector. So if you over-regulate the sector, it's always a danger that these people will sell an apartment and don't want to use as a rental. So I see some of the possibilities in this area, but I absolutely agree with Grzegorz that you cannot expect from the private rental sector, private owners to subsidizing the social housing.
Thanks a lot. Please go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, sorry, no, I just wanted to add a short comment to that we see, let's say, a sort of positioning sometimes of different players around a sort of intermediate or affordable housing sector. And I think this is something maybe still relatively quite new and linked to the fact that indeed affordability problems are touching a wider share of the population. I think without going into the details of any concrete experience, but in these cases, what I think governments have to be very much aware of is to make sure that whenever public spending is put into encouraging this kind of affordable housing solutions, they have to make sure that there is a system basically to keep money in this circuit. And what we see is that in some cases, instead, you will end up with sort of temporary agreements for homes that are rented at affordable rates for a given amount of time, and then after that they're sold at higher prices, or the rents go up, or people are evicted. So this is the kind of let's say risk that should be avoided on the long term.
Thanks a lot. Rachael, you also wanted to comment on that?
Yes, I think I do agree, with what's being said, that it's not the private sector's role to actually find solutions within social, the social sector. However, we often tend to demonize the private sector. What we really need is to create a counter language, which is, framed through a right to housing. So what we need is for the state to actually have a duty and maybe, create a very strong and solid social and affordable housing market. But it needs to be done in harmony with the private rented sector or with the private housing market. So all of these we have different housing pathways, need to work hand in hand. So I believe that what we really need is perhaps an audit of what is out there, and audits, that every city, so that we know who owns what and what we have, and because at the moment the housing market is quite speculative. So maybe this is where we need to shift. However, what I agree with Alice is that what we require is that we have different housing pathways. So if you fall off the housing ladder, then you will find a soft landing somewhere, that you're not ending up resorting to the private market to find a solution, because the private market will never support. It's not a charity. The private housing industry is business. It's a very high-risk business. So, it's not going to be able to support anyone who is in need. That is the duty of the state to take care of.
Thanks a lot. There's a few more questions in the chat. I'm just going to try to summarize some of that. Someone saying from Habitat, we cannot expect that there will be a huge policy shift in Central and Eastern Southern Europe to radically increase the social housing stock. What alternatives could you suggest to use based on what we have now in these sub-regions? Anyone who would like to maybe respond to that? Yeah. Yes, please. Gregor.
Yes. So I have to say that I remain optimistic still that it will be possible to radically increase the public sector spending in social and affordable housing in this region. I'm basing my optimism on examples of certain cities with whom we work, which actually go beyond the average. They stand out. One of the cities that I have in mind is a Polish city of Szczecin, and a representative of the housing company of that particular city will speak at this conference, I believe, on Friday. So cities like these give me this hope and allow me to remain optimistic that it will actually be possible to expect this this increase in spending and this increase in construction and this increase in affordable housing supply. And here at the EIB, we stand ready to support these activities by cities, by companies, with financing, with advice, with bringing parties together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There's one more question from Eva Gerolhazi. She's asking, do you think that housing measures and social measures should be combined for certain target groups in order to strengthen the individual economic basis behind housing? Anyone? Alice?
It's actually a very good point, and I think it's something that we see very much reflected in the strategy of many of the members of Housing Europe, that they see a shift in the role of housing providers from just bricks and mortars, basically, to also increasingly trying to bring in additional services to support their residents. And this is especially effective when it comes to people with certain needs, like elderly people or people with disabilities, and also people with multiple support needs, such as formerly homeless residents. Just one example above all, when the housing first approach is implemented correctly and there's sufficient finance for it and there's sufficient continuity, it's something that shows really good results for the tenants, but also in terms of saving to the public purse on the long term. So I think definitely this is a direction where we're going more and more in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're almost at the end. Is there anything else that maybe you want to comment on, something that someone else has said, or is there any other question from the audience? I don't see any at the moment. Oh, sorry, at the moment. Someone else. Thank you, Jozsef, for having mentioned the social rented agencies as one of solutions for groups from so-called rental gap. Inclusion of housing stock from the private sector should be linked to incentives from the public funds, tax or subsidies for balancing the difference in prices. Do you want to comment on that?
I just one so that I think as a crucial question, how the local government are working. So there are very good cities in Hungary, good municipalities, but financially, how the intergovernmental fiscal relation works in Hungary, it is they don't make them any incentives for the local governments to invest in social housing. So I think it's very important that to think some kind of intergovernmental fiscal incentives for the municipalities to do an active and positive role in this area. I think it's one.
Thanks a lot. I think we're going to conclude here. I think it has been really interesting to hear from all the different perspectives, basically from sort of macro perspective from the European Union, EIB, and then also the perspectives of the different national issues and problems. I'm not going to try to summarize all of that, but I think some of the main themes that have come out for me is the issue of housing and the links to the growing inequality, housing basically having become a commodity and being a source of wealth for the ones, while we've seen housing precarity increasing for lower income households and also for middle income households increasingly. I think also the role of the actors and maybe of tenure is something that has come out in these discussions in terms of the role of rent and especially affordable housing, affordable rented housing. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for everyone for your contribution. It was really interesting discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Deal Nelson.
Thank you, Gerald, and all of our speakers there, Rachael, Grzegorz, Jozsef and Alice, for a great session and for ending our day with a flourish. It's been, I think, a corker of a day. We learned about the different levels of social housing and affordable provision in different parts of Europe, how there's a relatively higher provision in Western Europe, but a greater focus on private ownership in Southern, Central and Eastern Europe, which in some cases has depleted the proportion of social and affordable housing as a percentage of the total housing stock, and that this is exacerbating the problem, and governments in those regions will have to revisit their policy priorities on this. How can we maintain homes earmarked for younger people in the social housing stock and prevent these homes being sold off? And if government policy in those areas is unlikely to change, what alternatives are there for affordable housing provision? We've discussed how housing is not simply the product of a construction industry and top-down government, but has within it the potential for radical change in our social relationships, to put the marginalised at the centre of social housing policies and projects as equal partners in their own destinies. Now, we've heard how housing is a toll gate for democratic and civic rights to participate and access services. More importantly, we've heard examples from Africa, South America, Asia and Europe where this is exactly what's happening. We heard a fascinating anthropological take on the changing nature of social housing need, the need for policymakers to recognise the changing nature of relationships, gender roles and family arrangements in planning provision. We need a compassionate approach to create opportunities for all to access decent housing. We've explored earlier how climate change impacts the most vulnerable disproportionately. The wealthier catch it by the handle, the poorer by the blade. We heard how rising numbers of urban poor will be first in the floodwaters and to wilt in more frequent heat waves. They will be in the crossfire of the battles for increasingly scarce resources. How can they be supported to access lower carbon sources of energy when they remain so expensive? Where are the affordable low carbon alternatives? We heard some fascinating comments on the fact that while refugees and displaced people do not say they fled climate change is often a root cause of the conflicts which cause them to flee. Climate change as a background factor in flight raises urgent questions of our emergency responses and highlights the need for preemptive, coordinated, holistic approaches and action focused on local need and, where possible, local sourced solutions. We've said before that this forum is about hope and solutions, and the most hopeful comment of the day was from one of our speakers who said that the way the world has responded to the threat of COVID-19 highlighted a capacity for change and adaptation we may not have believed we had. Where there is will and commitment, we can achieve great things. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow at 1 p.m. when we have another great day chock full of fabulous discussions on how we can tackle energy poverty and align energy and social policies in Central and Eastern Europe, how energy efficient renovations can tackle energy poverty as the region recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be looking at housing policy at the European level and to the future of housing in 2030. I'll look forward to seeing you here tomorrow. Good night.